Hello everyone, and good morning. Thank you for turning out on this rather damp affair for this very important keynote. I'm Sebastian Payne, Onward's director, and I couldn't be more thrilled to be hosting our speaker this morning. The mission of this think tank is straightforward: to develop bold and modernising ideas to tackle some of the biggest problems facing the country. As you may have noticed, many of our solutions come from the centre-right, but we've been very proud to work with politicians from across the spectrum over the last 5 years. Last year, Onward popped up at the Labour Party conference for the first time, and I'm delighted that we'll be back there again this year with a full programme of events focused on the core themes of our research: delivering levelling up, progressing energy security and net zero, becoming a science superpower, and exploring future political trends and repairing our sometimes torn social fabric. It is the last point that brings us here today. On no topic is there more agreement between the left and the right of British politics than on the fact that Britain's childcare system is entirely and wholly broken and requires urgent reform. Last year, we published an excellent report by Onward's own Belle Guillaume, who argued that the present system is too expensive, inflexible and complex. Her report said that childcare was simply unfit for purpose. It was harming children's development. It was placing huge strains on families, particularly as the cost of living crisis bites. Way before Rishi Sunak, or even Keir Starmer, came up with the notion of bold 5-point plans, Onward was there first, with our set of proposals to simplify and reform both the taxation and supply of childcare provision. Our work was endorsed by the Conservative MP Siobhan Bailey, who sits on Onward's advisory board, who said that our research proposed simple and clear solutions for an area that was equally important to the lives of children and adults. With interest on the Conservative side about repairing childcare, it's no surprise that Labour are thinking about the same issues. It will no doubt be a critical election issue, whenever that may be, and we're delighted to host our speaker today to hear more about her party's approach to this critical issue. It's a particular delight to welcome Bridget Phillipson, who is one of the most thoughtful and wise heads on the Labour front bench. She may not agree with all of Onward's policy prescriptions, sadly, but we have more often than not shared the same concerns and areas of interest. And there is a personal bonus too. It's not often that two people from Gateshead are able to stand on a stage in Westminster to have an in-depth conversation about the critical challenges facing the country. It's something we can both agree there needs to be a lot more of. So as the rallying cry of Gateshead Town FC goes, "Away the Heed," please welcome to the stage the Shadow Education Secretary, Bridget Phillipson.
Thank you very much, Seb, and it's wonderful to be with you here today, and thank you very much for hosting us. I hope you'll not think it graceless of me to say that I've not felt this apprehensive about a speech since I spoke at the National Education Union's conference last year. And I'm hoping that this time no one will walk out and protest halfway through. But perhaps I should say that if you think Labour should be abolishing Ofsted, now is very much the time to leave the room. More seriously, I do want to say a big thank you, Seb, to you and the team at Onward for hosting me today. I think one of the ways in which public life is really very rich in Britain, behind the headlines, is the breadth and quality of the work of our think tanks, focusing on how big a change could happen, not just on making our current systems sing, but looking around the world at how other societies solve similar problems and looking ahead to the challenges that we face. Now, no party, no think tank has a monopoly on good ideas. And parties and politicians who are confident in their values should have no fear of the voices, policies or ideas with which they might not always agree. So I enjoy reading Onward's reports, just as I enjoy reading the IPPR. I'll hear from the Centre for Social Justice as well as from the Fabians. And amid that cacophony, Onward has been an increasingly thoughtful voice, not least in education and not least on childcare. And like all of us, I like to hear a challenge in familiar tones, so it is brilliant to be joining a fellow North East and Gateshead expert here today and to have this opportunity. Reading Onward's work over recent months, there was a line in the foreword to your report on post-pandemic recovery, The Good Life, that really caught my eye. And it said that strengthening our social fabric is a key way to improving the lives of people across our country in a meaningful way. I couldn't agree more, and that's why I'm here today. That line points us at 3 problems. And after 13 years, those are problems for which the Conservative government does need to take responsibility. The social fabric in our country is too weak. The lives of our people need to be made a lot better. And strengthening our social fabric is a key part of that improvement in living standards. The missing word, of course, not missing from Onward's report, but missing from the government's approach for the last 13 years, is family. As politicians, we often talk about schools, colleges, nurseries, universities. We talk about children and young people as pupils, as students, learners, apprentices, but it's a shorthand. Institutions are there to serve the people, but people should never be seen merely as the furniture of those institutions. Even Mrs. Thatcher knew, as she rejected the reality of society, that there are families. Children and young people are part of families. You'll not be surprised to hear that I part company with both the Scottish National Party and the Conservatives on what families are. I learnt as a kid what families thought, what the Conservatives thought of families like mine. Because my mum brought me up on her own, at a time when the Conservative government saw its role for families like mine as one of judgment. Ministers like Peter Lilly went out of their way to attack us, to criticise us, not to support us, to demean us, not to empower us, to doubt us, not to believe in us. And I was lucky, because I had a family and a school that believed differently, that believed in the value and worth of each and every one of us. But too many children didn't have both of those advantages. But that experience didn't make me think that somehow families are unimportant, quite the opposite. My mum might have been short of money, but never care or love. She and her parents read with me, discussed ideas with me, taught me to question and to think. My grandfather sent me books all his life. What children need is a family. What government needs to do is to ensure that families have the chance to succeed and the time to thrive together. My childhood taught me that what matters about families is not the shape they are or the size they have, but the love they give. Now, sometimes people on my own side tell me that not everyone has a family. I reject that with every fibre of my being. It is a pernicious myth, one that gifts the concept of family to those who draw its definitions narrow and tight. It excludes and demeans. Now, of course, people fall out of their families. Of course, people fall out with their families. And for some people, families aren't even blood relations. But families are about love and about time, not structure and legislation. And the government is failing families. When families have neither the time nor the energy to succeed, we fail them, we fail our children, and we fail our future. Now, the last year has been a time of change in the ship of state. A summer of new ministers, the frantic political dynamism that comes of rearranging the deck chairs. Then a few heady weeks of steering headlong into an iceberg. The left-wing economic establishment iceberg, that is, not the lettuce which has outlasted the Prime Minister, but unlike many vegetables is still mercifully available in our shops. But there is one thing I will say for Liz Truss. She knew that what holds this country back is 13 years of Conservative failure on growth. And she recognised that as part of that failure is a failure to support families to deal with the cost of childcare. The world has changed, and childcare and family are the politics of the electoral battle ahead. In Britain, Google searches for childcare went up more than 100% in the last 6 years leading up to the 1st of January this year. And in the most 100 marginal Conservative seats in England, across those seats, the parents of children under 11 make up more than a quarter of the population. So in Britain next year, as in Australia last year, childcare will be central. Family is the fight ahead. Yet while she identified these problems, the solutions that Liz Truss pushed are not the right solutions, because the changes that she wanted were about tinkering with the system that we have, not reforming it to face the challenges ahead. What we need is not tinkering, but a bold and ambitious vision of how things can be better, not just a change on hours or ratios or thresholds. None of that measures up. What this government suffers from is a mode of reform that looks backward, not forward. And of course, it's not wrong to start by looking at what's broken. And my God, this government has broken a lot. Support for childcare is at once inadequate and delivered through too many systems, complex and confused. And the cost of childcare is pricing parents out of the jobs they love when it is available at all. Childcare itself is too often not the quality our children deserve or that staff want to provide. And all of this in a funding system which makes the problems worse. Worse because the government knows how much it costs to fund their model and yet still gives providers less. The Conservatives offer parents so-called free hours, then pay providers below the going rate to deliver them. The market that this underfunded hours system has created is one where providers too often go bust, where parents pay extortionate costs for extra hours, where managers cannot find the staff they need, and where staff cannot get either the pay or the progression that they deserve. Now, even I am old enough to remember a time when the Conservatives liked market solutions. But this isn't a market, it is a mess. And don't be fooled, it won't be made better by relaxing ratios. That will simply drive down quality with minimal impact on costs. And I'm also old enough to remember a time when the Conservatives listened to business, when listening to what employers said was something that they prided themselves on. But when a trade association tells you that 98% of its members say a change won't cut costs, and yet the Tories still float that they want to do it, that is when you know that ideology hasn't simply guided the Conservatives. It's worse. It's rotted them. Adding a few hours here or there is not going to work either. More free hours for parents means more underfunded hours for nurseries, more costs piled onto providers, struggling to deliver services as they are now, and more need for cross-subsidy. The model that they have built fails everyone. Rigid, inflexible, inadequate. Adding in more free hours could see the Conservatives crash the childcare market just as they crashed the economy. The model they have built is broken for providers, just as it is broken for children, for staff, for parents. But there's something else, something wider, that's wrong with childcare in our country, which goes to the heart of what family is about. Last autumn, our Shadow Chancellor Rachel Reeves asked families a very simple, very direct question. Are you better off after 13 years of Conservative government? Our schools, our NHS, and yes, our childcare system should be vehicles for enabling the aspirations of families across this country. Aspirations as families, aspirations for their communities, aspirations for our shared future. But too many children are let down by stuck schools which fail them year after year. Too many adults are not in work because instead they're in an endless queue for NHS treatment. And too many parents are denied the opportunity to work the jobs they'd like, to give their children the opportunities they'd like. Because again and again, they're let down by the high cost and low availability of childcare. The challenge for Labour is to define afresh the role for government, the role for parents, the role for families, and how these roles work together. When schools aren't supported, when standards slip, we know it's rarely individual heads or teachers who are failing our children. It is a wider failure. It is a failure by government. When families can't afford to take their kids out for the day, can't afford an ice cream at the park, a ride at the fair, children are being failed. When mums and dads don't see their kids in the evening or at the weekend because they have to work extra hours to pay the bills, children are being failed. And when parents skimp on food themselves, find themselves exhausted, worn out, without time or energy to spend time with their kids, children are being failed. But in each and every one of those cases, we know it isn't individual mums and dads, individual families who are failing our children. It is again government. Of course, parents have responsibilities, families have responsibilities, but government cannot hide behind them. Governments have responsibilities too. When support from families and support from government works together, we can ensure that every child succeeds. And when it fails, as today it fails, for too many families across too much of this country, too much of the time, it is our children who are failed, our children who suffer, and all of us, children and adults alike, whose futures will be poorer. Affordable, available childcare is what enables parents to earn, to succeed, and to have time enjoying being with their children. The Conservatives have forgotten the principle that all families hold dear. People do not live so they can spend their time working. We work in order to have a richer life. It is Labour that knows that. It is in our name. Labour is the party of working people, not just workers, people. And it is because of that that Labour is the party of the family. I said earlier that what matters about families is not the shape they have, but the love they give. And let me spell that out just a little. I want not just parents, but grandparents, aunts and uncles, to regard children as a blessing, never a chore. To look forward to spending time with their grandchildren, their nieces and nephews, every little bairn in the family, not a stopgap so parents can get to work and get on at work. I want strong families where the bonds are of love, and the foundation of that love is time spent happily together. Because those strong families, rooted and grounded in love, are the basis of strong societies. The society Labour exists to build, where opportunity is for everyone and no one is left behind. And let me tell you, it isn't just this government that misunderstands family. Sometimes organisations tell me, organisations that should know better, that childcare isn't a big problem, pointing only at the money spent on formal childcare. I tell them, you have not understood. Family is more than finance, and childcare is more than formal costs. Childcare is informal obligations, duties, expectations shaped by sex and age, not just pounds and pence. Expectations that fall more heavily on grandmothers than grandfathers, on mothers before fathers. Only a party that understands families can understand the challenge of childcare. It's a problem for the shape of our society, not just its finances. I get that. Rachel gets that. Kia gets that. The Conservatives have not, do not, and clearly will not. Again, it is Labour that today is the party of family. If the Conservatives ever wanted to say the same, let me set out some of the tests I believe they have to meet. At the start of the year, the Prime Minister set out his 5 priorities. They did not mention children and they do not mention childcare. So the first test is whether this features in government thinking at all, whether they recognise that there is a problem and that there is a need for change. The second test is whether they have listened to parents, whether ministers recognise that simply bolting more hours onto a failing system will not tackle the problem of availability and will not tackle the problem of affordability. The third test is whether they are delivering what children need, high quality early education and care. Weakening quality by reducing ratios, the very last thing that parents want, simply cannot meet this test. And the ongoing failure to deliver a proper workforce strategy cannot meet this test. We must go beyond tinkering with a broken system. The real challenge isn't what this government stumbles through next. It's what the next government will have to do. In the Britain the Tories will leave behind, tweaking the system we have will not deliver the ambition or scale of reform we are going to need. Of course, every government needs to understand the system it inherits. But real reform is more than looking backwards and building a better yesterday. It means looking ahead at the challenges which will face us tomorrow, looking at the trends which have driven change for decades and the trends that are driving it now. For childcare, the biggest change is one that Labour gets, which some Conservatives get, but sadly neither Rishi Sunak or Jeremy Hunt seem to understand. It's about the different shape of families today. Because the peacetime story of Britain, over 3 generations, has been many things, but in particular, it has been a story of the changing roles of women, driving through successive generations the changing shape of families. Not of women entering the workforce, women have always worked, but of women entering the paid labour market in big numbers, women being economically active outside of the home. In Britain, women's economic activity increased by nearly 2.5 times in the last 70 years. Labour gets that because in large part, these are the changes that Labour wrote. Our grandmothers, our mothers, us. 1 adult, 1 vote, requiring equal pay, outlawing sex discrimination, ending sacking for pregnancy, civil partnerships, adoptions in every family with love to give. Labour doesn't just understand modern families, Labour changed the law to enable them to thrive. And 3 generations of progress have narrowed inequality within families. There is still a long way to go, but we have come a long way. So Labour looks ahead and we see the case for reform. As Labour has done in each previous generation, our generation will rise to the challenge of the age. The next Labour government will build the social infrastructure long overdue after 13 wasted years that modern families of every size and description need. A modern childcare system that gives families choices, enables parents to work and delivers the best start for every child. But to do change well, you don't just look at how you might do better, reasoning from the weakness of where you are. No. When parents in this country spend more on childcare than in almost any other OECD country, you have to imagine that not just some others, but many others might just be doing it better. We have to look not just around these islands, but around the world. That's why I was pleased to visit Estonia in the autumn, to see how they have made early high-quality childcare a part of every childhood, a support for every family, and integral to the education system all of our young people deserve. That's why I visited Australia, to see a system on the move, where the salience of a general election and a new government hungry for change is delivering for families at pace. That's why I'm planning to visit Singapore to see what Britain can learn from their childcare and skills system. And it's why I plan to visit Ireland to see a new funding model and a new sectoral deal for childcare. Because the reform agenda of the next Labour government will be lit up with the achievements of successful future-facing governments from right around the world. But you all know that even this is not enough. You can take bright ideas from around the world, but you have to make them work here. The State of England school system since 2010 is a monument to what happens when politicians simply copy policy off the Scandinavian postcard. A system not merely fragmented but fractured, where the slow rot of focusing on structures over standards fails a fresh generation of children, where ambition is untethered from the hard realities of fiscal policy and workforce availability. Reform means change for good, change for the better, change that endures, change that is planned, and change that delivers. And we know it can be done well, because the last Labour government did it better. We delivered change across our country. But I want to issue a warning. If I had £1 for every time I was told that what Labour needs to do is to bring back Sure Start, I'd be solving the fiscal challenges in all of our public services right now. Sure Start was an amazing achievement, one of which I and the Labour movement are deeply proud. It delivered a better start for so many families, for so many children. Family hubs a pale shadow of what Labour achieved. Now, leaving aside the bitter irony of a Conservative government introducing a new social programme to fix the problems they spent a decade creating, focus on what is missing. Universality. Labour started with Sure Start targeted, piloted and slowly rolled it out. There is little sign of that ambition today. And education. Family hubs may support the public health aspects of early childhood for those who live near one, but I want to go further for our families. The programme guide for family hubs and Start for Life mentions education or similar 32 times, but the only direction is that families should be educated about breastfeeding. I know the Family Hubs project was inspired by the work of Andrea Leadsom, and I think we all probably know, that Andrea Leadsom is a mother. And I want every mother, of course, to feel confident breastfeeding, if that's what works for her and her child. And I mean no disrespect to Andrea or to the many people who work to support proper infant nutrition. If I say that my ambition for early years education for our children must stretch well beyond how they are fed. And I will not judge family hubs simply by the standard of Sure Start, because the failure is greater than being a hollow imitation of the past. Because let's be honest, there were issues with Sure Start too, and it is best that we are honest about them. A Labour Party that wins elections learns from what didn't work as well as what did. And the first issue is that the case for Sure Start was made only from government. Sure Start was never tested in the fire of an election campaign, never given salience in public debate. In 1945, we promised that the best health services should be free at the point of need. We delivered within 3 years a national health service that has, through thick and thin, and despite the best successive efforts of Conservative governments, endured to this day. We promised in 1963 and again in 1966 a University of the Air to give everyone the opportunity to study for a full degree. We delivered the Open University and again it endures. And in 97, we promised education, education, education. We promised a national minimum wage to tackle low pay. Our schools were transformed because Labour's ambition for our schools never sleeps. And as for the minimum wage, no one now seriously argues against it. The Tories have rebadged it, but they will not run from it. These are the reforms that are effective, and these are the reforms that last. And I believe that to last, reforms need not merely to be right, but they also have to be won. That is the test to which Sure Start was never put, and which I believe has been part of the reason for its slow crumbling. I'm determined that change in childcare and early years is a change that endures. That is why I am proud that Labour's mission to break down barriers to opportunity, which Keir spoke so powerfully about last month, includes reform of education and childcare. And be in no doubt, childcare reform will be my first priority. To deliver that mission, to break down those barriers, to give every child and every family the best start in life. The second issue with Sure Start is more subtle but just as important. Go back 20 years. Gordon Brown was very clear that the purpose of Sure Start should be to bring together high-quality services for young families, to boost children's healthcare and prepare them for school. In truth, that isn't quite what happened. The government slowly moved the goalposts. By 2000, the expansion of Sure Start was to advance the government's objectives on single parents' employment. And by 2005, officials openly described Sure Start's capture by the employability agenda. Now, these things happen to many programmes in many governments, but I contend they happen more easily when these things are plans from within government rather than missions carried into government. Because Sure Start was many great things, but too often the educational and healthcare component fell down the priority list. That's why when people tell me we need to bring back Sure Start, I know they have a set of policy priorities with which I am deeply sympathetic, a set of values I share, but an approach to reform with which I differ. The better future our children need will not come simply from winding back the clock. Labour and power will be different. The missions that we will take into government will shape the priorities and the principles for the change we deliver. Our focus around childcare is and will remain threefold: better for parents, better for children, and better for families together. We are the party of family, of every shape and size, and that reality will be a thread through all our policy. We have said that childcare needs to be more available, more affordable, better quality, but it also needs to be better linked to educational priorities, better geared to closing attainment gaps, and better at enabling all of our children to succeed at school, at college, and at university all throughout their lives. And it needs to have at its heart the knowledge that good childcare right throughout childhood is about enabling and supporting families to spend time together, to enjoy time together, to grow up together. These are the principles, because the missions are about setting principles and giving direction. Children coming to school ready to learn, parents given choices in the workplace, families with the time to spend together, and all of this supporting and enabling a growing economy. Because I tell you now, Labour will not invest in a broken system of childcare provision that doesn't deliver for families, for children, or for our economy. The Conservatives' failure on growth means that we do not know what our fiscal inheritance might be. But we will not be straitjacketed by the piecemeal, jerry-built system left to us by the Conservatives. Our focus will be on reform. Our plan will build a broader coalition for the reforms our children, parents, and families need. Of course, there will be places where not everyone's interests align. Of course, people will disagree with each other. But the politics that will carry our plan through will be about looking ahead, about giving people reasons to embrace reform, not reasons to resist it. Crucially, the costs of childcare don't go away as children clear the early years. The next Labour government will build a modern childcare care system, one that supports families from the end of parental leave right through to the end of primary school, one that gives every child the best start in life, because the evidence couldn't be clearer. Gaps in learning and development, gaps in opportunities open up early, so our plan must start early too. We started last autumn with a costed, funded plan for breakfast clubs. These clubs will deliver better for children, better standards, as the Education Endowment Foundation evidence makes absolutely clear, better behaviour and better attendance, because it's about the club as well as the breakfast. Better for parents and better for their employers, and better for families, tackling the costs and needs they face. That plan is the first step on the road, an ambitious route we will chart over the months and years ahead, from opposition and through missions into government. This is the mission for our children, our young people, and all of their futures. Because the ambition that in my work, day after day, week after week, month after month, always impresses and inspires me most, is that of our children. Determined to succeed after years of disruption from COVID, preparing and campaigning for a better world in the era of the climate emergency, raising money for refugees from Ukraine, giving of themselves to help others, imagining a world not just better for them but better for all of us. And after more than a dozen years of Conservative rule, Britain is a weaker and poorer country in so many ways. But my politics are about hope. I am determined that our best days lie ahead of us. I am determined that the ambition Labour had in the 1940s to build a better society, fit for our values and the time. The ambition that we had in the 60s to deliver social justice in the white heat of industrial change, and the ambition that we had in the 1990s to rebuild and renew our country is the ambition that Labour matches today. Our children are born into a country with a proud history, but they deserve a bright future too. It will be my mission, my privilege, to deliver it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Bridget. An awful lot of food for thought and things to get stuck into there. Let's begin with some questions from the media. We first of all have Alex Forsyth from the BBC, who I can see just there.
Hello, thank you so much. Hello, Sebastian. Hello, Bridget. Alex Forsyth, BBC News. You've talked a lot, outlined what you see are the problems with what you call the broken childcare system. The obvious question, what is the reform that you're talking about? You say it's not right just to put more money into free hours. Would you do away with the free hours system? And if so, what would you replace it with?
I do believe that we need to move away from the system that we have right now. That broken hours model isn't working for parents, it's not working for children, and it isn't working for providers either. We'll be looking at in the months ahead about what that different model will involve, but I'm clear it has to involve raising standards in the sector too, a better deal for staff, working in early years and childcare, and has to provide sustainability and choices for parents. But I'm keen to have that conversation about what that different model looks like. Pouring money into a broken system, tinkering around the edges, adding in a couple of extra hours here and there is not going to deliver what our children and families need.
Thank you. We now have Harry Horton from ITV.
Thank you very much. Harry Horton, ITV News. You've talked a lot about the problems with the current system. I'm sure many would agree with you. Many in government might agree with you about those problems in the current system. But can you tell us some tangible changes that an incoming Labour government would make? Or are you still working on those changes?
So we've set out the direction, which is a modern childcare system from the end of parental leave to the end of primary school. The first steps being breakfast clubs for every primary school child in England, because all parents know that your childcare needs don't end when your children arrive at school. That would make a massive difference to so many parents. A fully funded, fully costed plan to deliver breakfast clubs for our children. Going beyond that, what I've been setting out today is a need for us to move beyond this broken system that we have, to think differently and to think bigger. That's why I've been really struck by the examples that I've seen around the world where they have a different model of funding, but also alongside that where they're delivering high and rising standards, because I want all children to arrive at school in the best possible position to thrive and to succeed. And what we've got right now is not delivering that.
Thank you. And Tamara Cohen from Sky News.
Hi, Tamara Cohen from Sky News. Britain doesn't invest as much in childcare as some other countries, and the message loud and clear from those providing the childcare is that they want more investment, billions of pounds more investment. Is Labour promising to provide that, and where will that funding come from?
Well, because the Conservatives crashed the economy, we're going to face some pretty tough choices if we come into government around what we have to prioritise. But I'm clear that part of our plan around economic growth will involve making sure we've got the right kind of childcare system there in place. What we're seeing at the moment, of course, is that so many parents, mothers in particular, are not returning to work after having their first child. That is a real shift in trend, but also more women in particular giving up jobs they love and cutting back on their hours. Now that has a real impact on the individual and the family, but it comes at a real cost for all of us too, whether, around economic growth and productivity. But the next steps around what we set out, consistent with everything that Rachel Reeves has said, will be fully funded and fully costed, because economic credibility does matter, and I want to make sure that when we're setting out change, we've got a plan to make it happen and make it work. That has to involve workforce reform too.
Thank you. Catherine Forster from GB News.
Hello, Catherine Forster, GB News. It's estimated that on current trends, there'll only be 1,000 childminders in England by 2035. There were 60,000 just 20 years ago. What are you going to do to reverse that? And how is it all going to be paid for?
I mean, childminders are a really important part of our system, and I think particularly the flexibility that they will often provide to families where there are shift workers. And like many parents, I found, we used a childminder, and the childminder was absolutely brilliant. We do see that decline in numbers. I am concerned about that. I think there are steps that you could take to address some of that bureaucracy and paperwork to make it easier for childminders to be a part of that system. But I want to make sure that we do have a diverse system where parents' needs are being met, where quality is really high right across the board.
Thank you. Now we're going to take a couple together now to get through as many people as possible. So Theo Ushwood from LBC and Chris Smith from The Times.
Thank you, Theo Ushwood, LBC. If I heard you correctly, Bridget Phillipson, you're not going to bring back Sure Start centres to anywhere near the same level as they were under Gordon Brown and Tony Blair. And could I ask why? Because just looking at some research from another think tank, which described them as delivering one of the long-lasting health benefits for children through their teenage years, and saying that they prevented around 13,000 hospitalisations of children aged 11 to 15-year-olds. This was one of New Labour's flagship policies, one of its most successful policies, but going by what you said today, you've no intention of bringing it back.
As I said, Sure Start transformed lives, made a massive difference to children and to parents, and the evidence is very clear about early intervention and early support and services brought together around children. That's clearer now than even it was then. But the tragedy of Sure Start is that it wasn't change that we saw endure, and I want to make sure where we have lasting change within our system, it stands the test of time and can't simply be undone by governments that come in later down the line. We didn't secure that longer term implementation of Sure Start that made sure it became part of our infrastructure, and I want change that we deliver from government to last.
Thank you. And Chris?
Thank you, Chris Smythe from The Times. You talked a lot about family, which is politicians are sometimes reluctant to do. Do you think, perhaps because of a sense of being seen to be a sort of finger-wagging, I've got a little list kind of a moralist, do you think politicians are too reluctant to talk about family? Do you want to see them talk about it more? And if so, do you think Labour are better placed to do that? And if so, what does that lead to in terms of practical policies? Does it lead to sort of tax breaks or subsidies for grandparents, other relatives who want to look after children? And if I could just quickly add, you talked a lot about this childcare not getting the political attention that it deserves, not being at the top of the news agenda. We're currently into day 2 of the BBC and many newspapers leading on Gary Lineker's tweets. Do you think they and others, just Tory MPs, have just lost all sense of proportion here?
Well, I am glad that we're talking more about childcare, because when you talk to voters right across the country, when I knock on doors, when I'm in those marginal seats that we need to win next time, voters raise it all the time as a really big concern. So I'm glad it's rising up the political agenda. We've been doing our part in making sure that it has greater salience and it's talked about more. Where it comes to what we mean when we talk about families, yes, sometimes politicians and actually those of us on the left will shy away from talking about family, but actually that's how voters will often view their lives. They will think of their life in terms of their family, and I'm not ashamed or afraid of talking about family. I grew up in a single parent family at a time of real judgment, and I know that families come in different shapes and sizes, but what matters most is that the love that they can provide, and I think it's about how government can make sure that all families in whatever composition, get the support that they need in order to have happy lives.
I noticed you avoided mentioning Gary Lineker there. Very wise. Kieran Stacey from The Guardian.
Kieran Stacey from The Guardian. You've talked about moving away from the 3 hours system. How quickly do you think you will be able to phase that out? And you say you haven't decided yet what system you want to replace it with, but you do talk favourably about the system in Estonia, where childcare is delivered, as you say, through the education system, through schools. Is that something you'd like to see happen? And if so, what would that mean for private providers?
I want to see early years education and care becoming part of our education system overall. There is a role for private providers, there is a role for the maintained sector, there is a role for childminders in delivering that. I think what will matter most is about how we drive up standards right across the board in making sure our children get a great start in life. We will be looking in the months ahead about what alternatives to that hours model will be. We're still some way out from the general election. But of course, what I want to make sure is that where we do set out detailed plans about what that alternative will be, that we're absolutely confident that we can deliver on it and that we've got a clear workforce plan running alongside that too. Because even if the government were to announce in the budget a few extra hours here and there, that is not going to deal with the scale of the challenge that providers are facing. It doesn't address the fundamental challenges. And what Labour is about is making sure that we are looking at the challenge as it stands and thinking differently and more imaginatively. And looking to other countries, yes, Estonia, but also Australia, where of course they won an election off the back of having a really strong message around childcare for families.
Thank you. Lucy Fisher from Times Radio.
Hi, Bridget. You highlight the sky-high cost of childcare for families. Do you think it's fair for working parents to have to pay for childcare out of their post-tax income? And shouldn't childcare be treated for families where all parents are working as a legitimate work expense for tax purposes?
I think the trouble with where we've got to at the moment with the system that we have is that there are lots of different entitlements, lots of different pots of money and a very fragmented system. I want that to be brought together in a way that works for parents. What we've seen with the tax-free childcare offer are real issues around take-up. The same is true in other elements of the system. I want to make it easy and straightforward for families to benefit. I want all children to get a really great start in life. I think that means taking that complexity out of it and making sure that early years education and childcare is brought into our education system in a way that makes it better integrated, but also in a way that lasts for the long term. We've seen lots of different bits of policy operating here from different governments. I think it's about having a more coherent vision overall about the kind of system we can deliver.
Thank you. Now, let's try something different and some questions from non-journalists. Or anyone else that would like to ask some questions? Go for the lady at the front here.
Hi, Antonia Bance from the TUC, the Trades Union Congress. Bridget, you'd expect me to ask this. Our childcare workforce are routinely underpaid, they don't have access to professional development. It's a very residualised workforce. You've mentioned reform, and it's always good to hear that you always do mention the needs of the workforce in addition to the needs of the parents to go to work. Are you able to expand at all?
Absolutely. As you'll know, what we have right now is a system where the amazing people delivering early years education and care are underpaid, undervalued and underappreciated for the work that they do. And they don't always have a voice within the sector overall or within wider society. And that's why so many of those amazing people end up leaving, burnt out, going elsewhere to work in, say, retail. I hear that time and again right across the country. All of that has to change. We need to make sure that all staff can expect decent terms and conditions, decent pay and proper progression. And I'm really interested in what they're looking at the moment in Ireland around a sectoral deal that will be about driving up standards, not just where it comes to the quality of provision, but also for the staff too.
Thank you. Let's take a couple together. Let's take these two ladies here, and then we'll take this gentleman here. Thank you. Thank you.
Sorry, I'll go first. Hi, Bridget. I'm Sarah. I run a childcare app called Bubble. We were, actually, both of us at the International Women's Day event for Labour yesterday evening. Focus was really about business and women in business. Today, the focus is about family. And what I've been struck by is there's actually been very little overlap between the conversation focus. And it seems to me when we've got a situation where we're talking almost 2 million women out of work because of childcare, because of the lack of affordability of childcare, lack of access to childcare, and businesses losing out because of the economy of that. Like, what more can we do for business to incentivise support for childcare?
Thank you. And the lady beside you.
Hi there, I'm Rachel. I'm the CEO and founder of Koru Kids, which is one of the UK's largest childcare providers and a childminding agency. Firstly, thank you for the focus on family. I absolutely love it. My question is around local government, local authorities. As a childminding agency, we often help our childminders, frankly, battle local authorities for the funding that they should be entitled to. It should come very easily from them. Local authorities have unfortunately gone from something that was very supportive of local childcare in the past, very supportive of childminding, to often a barrier. How do local authorities fit into how you're thinking about this?
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, local councils have to be a key part of all of this, both in terms of understanding the scale of what's needed within their area, and that was the situation in the past where they were more of a partner in identifying the need that was there, and also signposting parents to where support is available, particularly where it comes to nursery and early years provision. And I appreciate what you're saying around the challenges that childminders are sometimes facing. I do hear that quite a lot around the country, and that will be a part of what we're considering about how we make that change. And where it comes to how this all connects together, I mean, you know, where it comes to the work that we're doing right across Shadow Cabinet, whether it's Johnny Reynolds or John Ashworth or Rachel Reeves, we talk about these issues together a lot. We are working together really strongly on this. I mean, I've done lots of events with businesses around some of these challenges on skills, but also childcare. And just the other week, an event with the CBI on childcare. They know it's a big issue. They want government to take action. We're listening to what business are telling us, as well as parents. It will be brought together.
Thank you. Let's do one more round of questions here. Can I take the lady at back and then these two here? Thank you. This lady here. Thank you.
Good morning. Carol Homden, Group Chief Executive of Quorum, the first and longest continuing children's charity that published the childcare survey this morning. What that research shows over many years is that the worst childcare insufficiency affects disabled children and their families. Yeah. What steps will you be taking to prioritise that scandal? And secondly, will you be giving an undertaking that no child should be brought up in a family in the United Kingdom without recourse to public funds?
So firstly, just to say a big thank you to Quorum for all the work you do in highlighting these issues and giving us all the data that allows politicians to make arguments that are rooted in the evidence around the challenge we face. And I was particularly struck with some of the data today around how costs for 2-year-olds have increased when alongside the 3 and 4 year old offer. I think that demonstrates the challenge that we're facing with the existing hours model. Absolutely, we have to make sure that support services right across the board, whether that's within our schools or in early years education and care, work for disabled children and their families. We're facing a big crisis right across the SEND system, and I'm not confident that we're going to see much change in the next year or two. That presents us with lots of wider challenges, but that will have to be a central part of what we consider in this space too. Where it comes to no recourse to public funds, that kind of goes beyond entirely my area of responsibility. But I've worked with families in the past. When before I was an MP, I managed a women's refuge. We dealt with lots of families facing those kinds of challenges, and we need to make sure that we're recognising and picking up on need and providing the support that's necessary.
Thank you very much. And we'll take the final 2 questions at the front here.
Hi, Bridget. Sarah Ronan from the Early Education Childcare Coalition at the Women's Budget Group. As you know, we work with around 30 organisations from across the business community, trade unions, the children's sector, NGOs. We've all come together on this issue. We often talk at the coalition about a rescue and reform approach, and we've talked a lot about the need for reform with you and your team, and very much aligned on the need for that. But we have a very, very urgent crisis facing the sector right now, and we have a spring statement next week.
Yeah.
And I don't want to put you on the spot, but what would you like to see the Chancellor do next week to ensure that we can step back from the cliff edge that the sector is facing now, but also support families with this huge cost during a cost of living crisis?
Do you want to take that one, then we'll just take them on.
Absolutely. I think as a first step, what the Chancellor could do next week is to follow our lead in the non-dom tax status and make sure that we're delivering universal breakfast clubs across England. That would be really straightforward. The Chancellor could do that. If he wanted to steal that policy, I'd be absolutely delighted next week to stand, and welcome that, because it would deliver a really big change and real support for families around the cost of living. In terms of the immediate pressures that families are facing and the pressures on providers, the government know that they're underfunding. What they're asking providers to deliver. I can't change that from opposition, but government ministers, I think, do need to continue to be pushed on that.
And finally, our last question.
Thanks. Matthew Dodd from the National Children's Bureau. Just want to endorse Carol's comment on disabled children. Great to hear your commitments on that. I just want to raise the fact that as well as in the early years, there's actually a bit of a workforce crisis across the whole of the children's workforce. So whether we look in teaching, in social work, in health visiting, we're talking to the government now about some sort of integrated approach to the children's workforce, but just checking that that's something you recognise as well, and you encourage you to see it in the round and not just in specific sectors.
No, I'd absolutely agree with that. It's a challenge, whether it's in our schools, colleges or early years settings. There is a massive recruitment and retention issue. And I think partly that goes to the fact that we don't as a country value education as much as we should. We need a culture shift where we value and recognise education and the people delivering that amazing start for our children and young people.
Great. Well, thank you very much, everyone, for all your questions, the media and everyone else has come. Above all, a very big thanks to Bridget for giving such a fantastic speech. Lots of food for thought there on Sure Start, on families, about where things are going to go, and I'm sure we're going to be very excited to see what comes next. But please all offer a big round of applause to Bridget for doing this. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. And thank you all very much for coming. Thank you for everyone at Onward who's been involved in sorting this out, and everyone for the Labour Party for putting it together. And thank you all for coming in this slightly small and quite hot room on this day. Thank you very much. Thank you.